Alexander Vance was 32 years old, possessing the most recognized surname in the Chicago hospitality industry and a habit of resolving complicated problems before anyone even finished explaining them. He owned the Vance Group, a chain of 5 luxury downtown hotels that his father Arthur had built from the ground up through decades of relentless ambition. Alexander had multiplied this empire with a strategic, calculating coldness that his corporate competitors publicly admired and privately feared to their core. He was the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice because his absolute silence always communicated more than enough to anyone standing in his impeccably tailored presence. It was exactly 7:15 in the morning when Grace Miller, the veteran housekeeping supervisor for the Vance Imperial Hotel, dialed her boss's direct extension with a voice that attempted to be strictly neutral but failed completely. She stated that she urgently needed to speak about a highly delicate matter regarding a long-time employee assigned to the premium suites on floor 22. Alexander listened quietly, without lifting his sharp eyes from the morning financial reports spread across his mahogany desk, simply asking Grace to explain exactly what she had uncovered. It was Lucy Palmer, Grace explained with heavy hesitation, a quiet woman who had been leaving the building for weeks, with heavy cloth bags containing items she had absolutely no right to take. She was discreetly walking out with expensive moisturizer from the storage room premium minibar products and high thread count spare towels, taking nothing scandalous all at once to avoid immediate detection. However, the meticulous inventory numbers never lied, and the subtle daily discrepancies always coincided perfectly with Lucy's specific evening shifts on that luxury floor. Alexander turned his leather chair, slightly looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the waking city, while processing the highly conflicting fact that Lucy was considered the absolute best employee on that level. Grace admitted with genuine distress that she had waited almost an entire month to report this specific issue because she deeply wanted to be wrong about someone so exceptionally dedicated to her job. Alexander instructed Grace to put Lucy under strict but entirely silent observation for 1 week, alongside Marcus, the subtle lobby security guard, to gather absolute, undeniable proof before taking any drastic measures. The days that followed carried the heavy, suffocating tension that only exists in a workplace when someone is being closely watched without their knowledge. Marcus and Grace sent meticulous encrypted reports every 2 days, revealing a persistent, undeniable pattern of Lucy lingering far too long near the supply closets and leaving the building with a heavy posture. On the 5th day, Alexander made a sudden decision that his corporate advisors and security team would have strongly condemned. He decided to personally follow her himself to see exactly where she was going. Lucy Palmer exited through the heavy metal service doors at precisely 8:16 in the evening, carrying her woven cloth bag pressed tightly against her side like a closely guarded secret. Alexander watched her intently from his sleek luxury car, safely parked in the shadows at a distance, observing how she walked not with the exhausted, dragging rhythm of a finished shift, but with urgent purpose. She moved with the silent, desperate haste of someone who desperately needed to be somewhere else, ignoring the bustling city life entirely. She boarded a crowded city bus, and Alexander followed closely behind in his vehicle, watching the urban landscape shift dramatically outside his tinted windshield. The towering glass skyscrapers and elegant, brightly lit avenues of downtown Chicago quickly surrendered to highly functional gray blocks, which then rapidly faded into neglected, crumbling neighborhoods on the far south side. They reached an impoverished area characterized by unpaved, potholed alleys, continuously broken streetlights, and forgotten houses patched together with whatever cheap materials had been available at the time of their desperate construction. Lucy stepped off the bus at an unmarked, desolate stop and vanished down a narrow, shadowed street, prompting Alexander to quietly park his expensive car and follow her carefully on foot. He approached a tiny unplastered house with a sagging metal roof and a single dimly illuminated window, driven by a nameless instinct to fully understand the truth before destroying her livelihood. Stepping quietly over the broken concrete toward the glass, he heard Lucy's voice inside, sounding incredibly soft and far more real than it ever did in the polished, echoing corridors of his hotel. Alexander peered cautiously through the small, jagged crack between the decaying wooden window frame and the taped plastic sheeting, his breath catching instantly at the heartbreaking sight inside the poorly lit room. On a small, incredibly narrow bed, pushed hard against the peeling back wall, lay an elderly woman with pure white hair and painfully still hands resting gently on a heavy, faded blanket. Despite her obvious physical frailty and lack of movement, her dark eyes were vividly alert, shining with the kind of intact, sharp intelligence that often remains long after the body has already surrendered to illness. Lucy was kneeling gently on the hard floor beside the bed, holding the older woman's fragile hands before systematically laying out the contents of her heavy cloth bag on the scratched nightstand. She pulled out a high-end moisturizer, strictly reserved for the luxury suites, a premium hand soap, 2 small white towels, and finally, a bottle of medical-grade antiseptic solution stolen directly from floor 22. Alexander watched in stunned, paralyzing silence as Lucy poured the antiseptic onto a cotton pad to carefully and tenderly clean a badly infected intravenous access wound on her mother's heavily bruised arm. Just then, an interior wooden door creaked open, and a tall, painfully thin teenage boy entered the cramped room carrying a small, dented aluminum pot of steaming hot soup. This was Thomas, a 16-year-old who moved with the quiet, calculated caution of someone who had learned incredibly early in life how to occupy as little space as possible to avoid causing trouble. He softly announced that dinner was finally ready, his young face bearing a serious, crushing weight that absolutely no child his age should ever be forced to carry on their shoulders. Thomas approached the side of the bed, leaning down with immense care to press a gentle, lingering kiss against his grandmother's warm forehead, while whispering a profoundly soft good night into the quiet room. The old woman gripped his young hand with whatever fragile, fading strength she had left in her bones, instructing him in a barely audible whisper to make absolutely sure he took good care of his mother. She noted with heartbreaking clarity that Lucy would never stop to take care of herself, causing Alexander to feel something incredibly sharp and silent break completely inside his own heavily guarded chest. He stepped back from the glowing window, retreating quickly to the safety of his luxury vehicle, with his head bowed deeply and his hands shoved violently deep into his expensive coat pockets. Sitting behind the leather steering wheel in the dark, isolating silence of the car, he realized the devastating, undeniable truth: Lucy was not stealing items to sell for personal profit on the streets. She was stealing simply to heal her dying mother and his entire corporate worldview. Meticulously built on cold data and rigid, unforgiving logic, began to rapidly crumble around him in the span of a few agonizing minutes. That night, Alexander did not sleep for a single fleeting second, choosing instead to stand perfectly still in his dark, expansive penthouse, looking out over the glittering, wealthy Chicago skyline. He thought deeply about his powerful father, Arthur Vance, who had ruthlessly built their massive fortune while remaining entirely oblivious to the silent, desperate struggles of the invisible people actively polishing their imported marble floors. For the very first time in his 32 years of highly privileged existence, this systemic generational ignorance did not feel like a neutral business fact. It felt utterly and profoundly unforgivable. The haunting, tragic image of young Thomas carefully holding that dented pot of soup and the old woman's desperate plea to care for Lucy played on a relentless, tormenting loop in Alexander's exhausted mind. He realized with profound, sickening shame that Lucy had been scrubbing his hotel floors tirelessly for 2 full years, and he had never once bothered to learn her dying mother's name or ask about her well-being. The massive, horrifying disconnect between his immense, inherited wealth and her desperate daily poverty was a gaping chasm he could absolutely no longer pretend did not exist in his meticulously ordered world. The following morning, Alexander arrived at the downtown hotel long before the first housekeeping shift officially began, waiting silently with his heavy mahogany office door purposely left slightly ajar. He listened closely and patiently until he heard the familiar rhythmic squeak of Lucy's loaded housekeeping cart slowly moving down the long carpeted hallway of floor 22. Stepping out into the corridor, he watched her meticulously prepare for her grueling shift with a silent, ironclad discipline and efficiency that he had completely and unforgivably ignored for the past 2 years. Alexander softly called out Lucy's name, causing her to instantly turn around with dark, tranquil eyes that betrayed absolutely no emotion, surprise, or panic whatsoever in the face of her ultimate boss. It was the heavily guarded, impenetrable serenity of a working-class woman who had learned long ago in life never to anticipate anything good when an executive superior unexpectedly called her by name. He swallowed hard completely, abandoning his highly rehearsed, sterile corporate speech, and simply asked her to come into his office immediately because they urgently needed to discuss something of incredibly great importance. Inside the spacious, glass-walled office overlooking the bustling city, Lucy sat down stiffly in the plush leather chair opposite his massive wooden desk, crossing her calloused hands incredibly tightly in her lap. She sat with an impossibly straight posture, wearing the invisible, heavy armor of someone who deeply knows that displaying any trace of fear only surrenders far more power to those who already possess entirely too much. Alexander, who had spent his entire adult life fully mastering the dark art of corporate intimidation, suddenly found himself entirely at a loss for the right words to begin the necessary interrogation. Finally forcing his voice to remain steady, he brought up the unauthorized bag she had been routinely taking from the hotel, fully expecting a chaotic flurry of desperate denials, lies, or tearful excuses. Instead, Lucy offered an incredibly quiet, devastatingly calm surrender, plainly admitting that she knew exactly what he was referring to and making absolutely no pathetic attempt to hide behind fabricated stories. She explained with clear, unwavering dignity that her 71-year-old mother, Rose Palmer, was suffering from a cruel progressive disease that had slowly and permanently stolen her basic ability to walk and care for herself. Lucy detailed the crushing, inescapable mathematics of urban poverty, the exorbitant rent, the rising cost of basic food, and Thomas's vital school expenses left absolutely nothing remaining for the outrageously expensive medications her mother required to survive. She confessed that working exhausting 12-hour shifts wasn't remotely enough, and when she found her mother burning with a terrifying fever from an infected, poorly treated wound, she simply did what she had to do. If she had to miraculously go back to that deeply desperate moment, she stated firmly, looking him dead in the eye without blinking, she would absolutely steal the medical antiseptic all over again. Alexander listened to her confession, completely paralyzed and humbled by the profound, undeniable dignity of a woman utterly willing to lose everything she had to take full responsibility for saving her mother's life. He asked softly, his tone completely stripped of its usual executive authority, how long Rose had been terribly sick, and exactly who cared for her during those grueling 12-hour shifts at the demanding hotel. Lucy revealed that her 16-year-old son was the primary, daily caregiver, quietly sacrificing his own fleeting youth to tend to an invalid because they simply could not afford the basic bus fare to the public clinic. Pressing further into the painful history, Alexander asked about Rose's previous employment, desperately trying to understand how a hard-working woman could labor her entire life and end up with absolutely nothing but a broken body. Lucy hesitated visibly, her tone rapidly shifting into something highly cautious and guarded before revealing that her mother had spent her entire adult life working strictly in domestic service in the incredibly wealthy northern suburbs. Specifically, she had worked tirelessly as a deeply trusted live-in housekeeper in a single massive estate for nearly 20 grueling years before her body finally gave out. The heavy silence that violently crashed down into the executive office was heavier than lead, as Lucy finally quietly named the billionaire owner of that massive estate, Arthur Vance. Rose Palmer was the very woman who had lovingly cared for Alexander's childhood home, practically raising him in the lonely shadows after his own mother had unexpectedly and permanently walked out on the family. The staggering revelation hit Alexander like a brutal physical blow to the chest, completely and permanently reorganizing his entire understanding of his past and the invisible discarded people who had quietly held his broken family together. Refusing to let Lucy be crushed by his powerful family's toxic legacy, for a second time, Alexander firmly and loudly stated that she was absolutely not being fired under any circumstances whatsoever. He promised to immediately increase her monthly salary to a highly comfortable living wage and declared with absolute certainty that the Vance Group would comprehensively cover all of her mother's medical expenses moving forward. Lucy looked at him, utterly bewildered and speechless, her scarred hands visibly trembling as she slowly realized the incredibly heavy burden she had carried entirely alone for years was finally miraculously being lifted. Alexander immediately canceled every single one of his important afternoon meetings, an entirely unprecedented, shocking action that left his highly organized executive assistant staring at him in complete, unmasked confusion. He drove his car for 40 continuous minutes straight into the affluent, perfectly manicured northern suburbs, aggressively navigating the winding, pristine roads until he finally reached the massive, imposing stone gates of his father's estate. As he pulled into the long, sweeping driveway, he spotted David, the elderly, loyal groundskeeper, carefully pruning the lavish roses with a quiet dedication that suddenly felt incredibly heavy and tragic to witness. He found his father, Arthur Vance, sitting comfortably in the sprawling, perfectly landscaped backyard, casually sipping dark-roasted coffee and reading a financial broadsheet newspaper with the utterly unbothered calm of a man who owned everything. Arthur was 68 years old, still possessing a thick mane of snow-white hair and broad shoulders that effortlessly carried the commanding, intimidating width of his much younger, famously ruthless corporate days. He lowered the newspaper, slowly eyeing his only son with a highly calculating, sharp gaze, immediately noting that Alexander's incredibly sudden, unannounced midday arrival heavily signaled an approaching, unavoidable storm. Refusing the polite offer of freshly poured coffee, Alexander stood rigidly over his father and directly, sharply asked him if he remembered a specific woman named Rose Palmer who used to work in the house. Arthur's weathered face betrayed no dramatic visible shock, but his large hands went completely and unnaturally still, an incredibly rare microscopic pause that spoke absolute volumes to anyone who truly knew how to carefully read him. He slowly set his expensive coffee cup down on the glass table, his voice purposely dropping an entire octave as he carefully asked exactly why Alexander was bringing up that particular name after so many years. Alexander forcefully explained that Rose's deeply exhausted daughter had been scrubbing the floors at his downtown hotel for 2 years, desperately stealing basic medical supplies just to keep her dying mother alive in a freezing house. He fiercely demanded to know exactly why Arthur had callously dismissed a dedicated woman who had given nearly 20 full years of fiercely loyal, unquestioning service to their incredibly wealthy family. Arthur sighed deeply, quickly retreating behind his impenetrable corporate armor, coldly claiming it was a strictly necessary administrative restructuring because her accumulating seniority benefits had sadly become a highly significant financial liability to the household payroll. The sheer breathtaking coldness of the word liability, applied to a warm, loving human being who had practically raised him, made Alexander's blood violently boil with an unfamiliar, intensely righteous rage. He loudly accused his incredibly wealthy father of firing her specifically and maliciously because she got horribly sick, casually tossing her aside like a broken machine purely to rigidly protect the absolute bottom line. Arthur did not even attempt to deny it, admitting in a dangerously quiet, heavy voice that he made a highly calculated business decision, though he quietly confessed it was the absolute only one in his entire life he genuinely regretted. Alexander's racing mind instantly flashed to a deeply buried, faded memory, a small, incredibly frightened boy of 10 with a badly ripped school backpack silently despairing over his entirely ruined belongings in a massive, empty house. He suddenly and vividly remembered how a beautiful brand-new backpack had miraculously appeared resting on his bed the very next day. A quiet, profound act of grace, he now realized came directly from Rose's own meager pockets. He stared intensely at his father, utterly disgusted by the sickening realization that Arthur had ruthlessly traded a loyal, deeply loving human being for a slightly higher, utterly meaningless quarterly profit margin. Stepping aggressively back from the glass patio table, Alexander formally informed his father that he was personally taking complete immediate over of Rose Palmer's advanced medical care and total financial stability. He declared with absolute unwavering conviction that it was absolutely not a fleeting act of wealthy charity, but the highly overdue payment of a massive, incredibly shameful debt that the Vance family had entirely ignored for far too long. Arthur looked away slowly, staring blankly into the perfectly manicured trees, finally looking like an incredibly old, deeply diminished man who could simply no longer outrun the heavy ghosts of his own ruthless, unchecked ambition. Alexander quickly turned on his heel and walked briskly back to his luxury car, leaving his silent father completely alone in the suffocating, opulent silence of his massive, incredibly empty estate. He deeply knew the absolute hardest part of this journey was still waiting ahead of him. Simply writing a large check was the easy, cowardly way out for any incredibly wealthy man. To truly and permanently break the toxic cycle of his family's boundless arrogance, he had to drive back to that crumbling house, look Rose directly in the eye, and fully face the devastating human cost of his generational wealth. Later that dark evening, Alexander stood nervously on the incredibly uneven, rotting wooden porch of the Palmer house, knocking gently on the peeling front door with an incredibly heavy, anxious heart. Thomas opened the door slowly, his adolescent eyes instantly narrowing with the sharp, deeply ingrained, highly protective suspicion of a poor kid unexpectedly encountering an incredibly wealthy man wearing a tailored suit on his porch. After a highly tense, completely silent standoff, the protective boy cautiously stepped aside, silently escorting Alexander down the cramped, dimly lit hallway, straight toward the small back bedroom where his fragile grandmother lay resting. Rose Palmer was propped up gently against her incredibly thin, worn pillows, her deeply lined face partially illuminated by the incredibly soft, warm glow of a small, cracked bedside lamp. The exact moment she laid her eyes on Alexander, a profound, undeniable wave of pure recognition washed completely over her tired features, completely and effortlessly, bypassing the many decades that had passed since he was a small child. She smiled incredibly softly and immediately called him Alexander, completely dropping all expected formalities, speaking his first name with the intimate, gentle authority of a woman who had once lovingly wiped away his childhood tears. Alexander sat down heavily in the uncomfortable folding chair right beside her small bed, his incredibly expensive tailored clothes entirely out of place in the highly modest room, yet feeling strangely like he had finally come home. He openly confessed that he now knew absolutely everything, exactly how she had lovingly held his father's broken household together after his mother vanished, and exactly how brutally and unfairly she had been discarded. Rose waved a highly frail hand, instantly dismissing the heavy bitterness, gently explaining that she had completely forgiven his father long ago because fiercely carrying on to dark resentment was simply too heavy a burden for a sick woman to bear. She softly recounted the deeply touching story of the broken backpack, quietly confirming that she had indeed bought him a brand new one, strictly out of her own incredibly thin paycheck, because absolutely no lonely child should ever feel invisible. She confessed she had loved him incredibly quietly, strictly from the rigid boundaries of her housekeeper's uniform, deeply knowing her place, but absolutely refusing to let a young boy intimately suffer the freezing coldness of an empty mansion. Alexander listened intently, completely and utterly devastated by the sheer purity of her unconditional love, deeply realizing that this incredibly poor housekeeper had consistently possessed far more nobility than anyone in his elite, wealthy social circle. Reaching incredibly slowly behind a short row of heavily worn library books on her scratched nightstand, Rose produced a highly faded, carefully folded envelope containing her incredibly unfair original termination contract. She handed the fragile paper directly to Alexander, shockingly revealing the ultimate unforgivable betrayal. Arthur had aggressively coerced her into officially signing away her entirely rightful severance pay for an incredibly small fraction of its true value. She quietly explained she had never once told Lucy the truth about the stolen money, bravely choosing to absorb the total financial ruin herself, rather than permanently poison her daughter's heart with deep hatred for the powerful Vance family. At that exact highly charged moment, the heavy front door rattled loudly open, and Lucy stepped quickly into the cramped bedroom, freezing instantly in absolute paralyzing shock at the incredible sight of her billionaire boss sitting intimately by her mother's bed. Her dark eyes darted frantically and wildly between Alexander and Rose, absolute fear rising rapidly in her chest as the two completely separate, highly guarded worlds she had carefully managed violently and unexpectedly collided. She fiercely demanded to know exactly what was happening in her house, her voice trembling heavily with the fierce, highly protective ferocity of a desperately tired mother who felt her only safe sanctuary had been entirely breached. Rose gently patted the edge of the mattress warmly, motioning for her highly anxious daughter to sit down, and finally spoke the incredibly painful, entirely unvarnished truth she had fiercely hidden for so many incredibly difficult years. As Lucy carefully listened to the unbelievable story of the Vance estate, the cruelly stolen severance, and the deeply quiet sacrifices, the absolute iron composure she had flawlessly maintained for years finally shattered completely. She buried her face deeply in her calloused, overworked hands and wept uncontrollably, profoundly mourning the years of completely unnecessary suffering, while Thomas stepped quickly forward to fiercely and protectively grip his grandmother's incredibly frail shoulder. Alexander stood up slowly, respectfully, giving the deeply emotional family the highly sacred space they desperately needed to process the incredible torrential flood of newly uncovered history and raw, devastating grief. He gently placed a thick envelope containing the fully calculated, entirely corrected severance pay with decades of compound interest right on the nightstand, strongly vowing that the substantial funds would fully clear their bank account by early Monday morning. He looked Lucy directly in her tear-filled eyes, fiercely promising her that absolutely from this day forward she would absolutely never have to carry the crushing, suffocating weight of the world alone ever again. In the highly transformative weeks that quickly followed the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of pure survival that had permanently haunted the tiny Palmer house, slowly and completely evaporated, beautifully replaced by a highly cautious, deeply rooted hope. Dr. Henry Smith arrived promptly with highly advanced medical equipment, and Sarah, an incredibly compassionate registered nurse, both fully and permanently funded by the Vance Group's completely new, highly comprehensive medical trust. Rose finally received the absolute finest medical care available in the entire city of Chicago, perfectly ensuring her delicate condition stabilized warmly, allowing her to comfortably sit up longer and breathe entirely without the constant, terrifying shadow of pain. With the incredibly heavy burden of impending medical tragedy permanently lifted, Thomas miraculously transformed from a hypervigilant, exhausted caregiver completely back into a highly regular, bright 16-year-old boy, finally absolutely able to focus on his high school studies. He was happily enrolled in a completely new, fully and generously paid educational scholarship program that Alexander had quietly and swiftly established for the incredibly deserving children of all dedicated hotel employees. The cruel, deeply crushing cycle of generational poverty had been completely and permanently broken beautifully, allowing the bright teenager to look highly toward a promising future rather than constantly guarding the incredibly fragile present. Back at the towering Vance Imperial Hotel, Alexander worked completely tirelessly, right alongside Grace Miller, to systematically dismantle the incredibly cold, highly rigid corporate structure his wealthy father had foolishly worshipped for many decades. They successfully implemented a highly robust, genuinely empathetic employee welfare program, strictly ensuring absolutely no hardworking employee would ever be forced to desperately choose between feeding their hungry children and buying necessary life-saving medicine. The highly grateful hotel staff very soon realized with pure joy that their powerful boss was absolutely no longer a highly distant, calculating executive, but a deeply compassionate man who actively listened and truly valued their humanity. One incredibly quiet, sunny Sunday morning, Arthur Vance made the incredibly agonizing, highly humbling drive directly to the struggling South Side neighborhood, arriving completely unannounced right at the front steps of the modest Palmer house. He sat, highly uncomfortably, in the tiny, incredibly modest living room, a deeply humbled corporate giant, looking Rose directly and firmly in her wise eyes as he offered a highly profound, entirely unreserved apology for his past, unforgivable cruelty. Rose warmly accepted his incredibly difficult apology, with unbelievable, breathtaking grace, beautifully proving that true, highly enduring strength lies absolutely not in the ruthless accumulation of wealth, but in the boundless, incredible capacity to freely forgive the completely unforgivable. A few incredibly bright days later, Alexander easily found Lucy resting peacefully on the quiet stairs of floor 22, happily handing her an incredibly warm cup of coffee and a highly thick, highly lucrative, legally binding contract. It was absolutely not a pity offer of wealthy charity, but a highly formal, incredibly deserved executive promotion, officially appointing her as the absolute executive director of the entirely new Vance Group Employee Support Foundation. He warmly told her that her deeply painful lived experience was infinitely more highly valuable than any expensive corporate degree, and he desperately needed her incredibly sharp, highly empathetic eyes to always see the crucial things he had been utterly blind to. Lucy stared intensely at the lucrative contract, her beautiful dark eyes welling deeply with happy tears, as she completely realized her many years of entirely silent, devastating suffering had ultimately forged a highly powerful tool to actively save others from the exact same fate. She happily and proudly accepted the executive position, warmly raising her simple paper coffee cup to clink incredibly gently against his, fully cementing a beautifully silent pact between two highly different people who had bravely traversed a massive storm to entirely find each other. The incredibly deep, highly agonizing wounds of the painful past were finally beautifully closing, completely, leaving strictly behind heavily faded scars that perfectly served as highly constant reminders of the beautiful grace they had mutually discovered. Back at the quiet house, Thomas sat comfortably at the highly scratched kitchen table, furiously writing an incredibly emotional letter he would absolutely never send, beautifully releasing the incredibly lingering anger he fiercely held toward the highly flawed father who had utterly abandoned them. Rose slept incredibly peacefully in the small next room, her soft breathing deeply steady and highly calm, warmly surrounded by the beautiful, deeply quiet dignity of a highly difficult life that was finally absolutely being properly honored. The incredibly small house was beautifully filled with the highly profound, incredibly comforting silence of a highly resilient family that had successfully survived the absolute worst and beautifully emerged straight into the incredibly warm, utterly undeniable light of a completely secure future. Life rarely offers us the chance to completely rewrite the mistakes of our past, but it always presents the undeniable opportunity to change the trajectory of our future. True human wealth is never measured by the balances in our bank accounts, the properties we own, or the corporate empires we aggressively build, but by the dignity, respect, and compassion we afford to those who invisibly sustain our daily lives. When we finally reach the inevitable twilight of our years, the most valuable legacy we can possibly leave is the absolute certainty that we used our privilege and power to heal rather than to exploit. Facing the uncomfortable, deeply hidden truths of our own history is a painful and terrifying process, yet it remains the only genuine path toward lasting redemption and internal peace. We must constantly strive to look deeply into the lives of the people around us, intentionally recognizing their silent burdens and offering our hands not in condescending charity, but in profound, unwavering solidarity. The heaviest chains we carry throughout our lives are often the resentments we fiercely refuse to release, and the necessary apologies we are too stubbornly proud to give. Ultimately, true liberation comes when we fully realize that bravely asking for help is an act of immense courage, and freely giving it without expectation is the absolute highest expression of our shared humanity.